autism, and today, overcoming the achievement gap trap. It's quite a list. So we are grateful to have an expert with us today, Dr. Anthony Muhammad, here to share with us everything that we need to know. Anthony Muhammad currently serves as the CEO of New Frontier 21 Consulting, which is a company dedicated to providing cutting-edge professional development to schools all over the world. He serves as a practitioner for nearly 20 years and served as a middle school teacher, assistant principal, middle school principal, and high school principal. His tenure as a practitioner has earned him several awards as both a teacher and a principal. Dr. Muhammad is recognized as one of the field's leading experts in the area of school culture and professional learning communities at work. He was recognized by Global Gurus organization as one of the 30 most influential educational thought leaders in the world in 2021. And if that's not enough to get you excited about today's seminar, he's also a best-selling author and has published 26 articles in education journals and publications in 7 different countries. Wow, that's a lot. We are so lucky to have him here with us to share. So before I hand it over, like our other webinars, this will be recorded, and if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature. And as soon as I hand it over, I will post a link to Dr. Muhammad's seminar organizer, which includes links to today's presentation, handouts, and contact information. And in the last few minutes, like all of the other seminars, I will post a link to the chat in the survey asking for your feedback. This week, we did add a question to the survey because we want your help in planning for a second edition of the Transition Institute. So please take a minute to do the survey after today's seminar. And timing-wise, we should be wrapped up in about an hour. And lastly, thank you all for being here. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Anthony Muhammad.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Jacqueline, for inviting me. Thank you for all of you who have joined me for this 1-hour webinar. 1 hour is always so short, but I hope that I'm able to at least make an impression or at least get the ball rolling, that you would have the desire to look into this topic a lot deeper when I'm done. So hope this appetizer really kind of whet your appetite. So thank you. First, before I jump into the content, I want to thank all of you for the work that you do for children in LA Unified. You're doing really divine work. You are helping some of our most vulnerable populations transition into being independent adults and contributing citizens. And I don't think we take enough time to tip our hats to the people on the front line. And I want to thank you for all that you do for the children in Los Angeles and in LA Unified School District. So I wanted to, let me share my PowerPoint with you because I don't have a lot of time. So forgive me if we don't like sing Kumbaya or hold hands or something, because I just don't have that much time. And I want to just kind of get busy. But I do want to give you just a little bit of background on the webinar seminar I'm going to share with you today. As was mentioned, I've had the opportunity and pleasure to write many books. To date, I've written, co-authored 8 books. But in the year 2016, this book, which I'm going to give you kind of an overview of today, called Overcoming the Achievement Gap Trap, is a book that I published. And of the books that I've written, it's, to me, my signature work. It's the work that I'm most proud of because I think it has the potential to make a very deep impact on the profession. And the basis of the book comes from this question. I became really disturbed as we started to talk about things like equity and fairness and closing gaps and being egalitarian. I noticed and I analyzed that people were really just asking the wrong questions, and they really had the wrong mindset about it. A very counterproductive way of looking at the problem. And I wanted to reshape the dialogue. And if we can reshape the dialogue, then it makes us have greater access to solving these issues. So I want to start off by saying, before I jump into the material, we already know how to produce equity. We already know how to do it. There are societies that are moving very swiftly towards equity, and people are really happy and they're very egalitarian. The blueprint to do it already exists. So then the question becomes, how come we're not experiencing? It's because we haven't asked the right questions, and we haven't really looked at the problem through a lens that would allow us to be productive. So whenever I write a book, like any piece of scholarly work, and many of you may have written dissertations or theses, you always start your scholarly work with a literature review. You have a problem, you want to really analyze what have other people studied about the problem and what has been proposed and what has been done. Because what you want to do is make sure whatever you're trying to contribute is really a contribution to the literature, because there's very few things worse than writing a piece that's already been written. So one of the questions that I really pondered in writing this work on the achievement gap was, is equity even a core principle of the American public school system? Maybe we're asking the system to do something it was never designed to do. So one of the books that I used to really dive into the literature on equity in American school was a book called Tinkering Towards Utopia, written by the great Larry Cuban and Dr. David Tyek. And they do an historical analysis of the evolution of the American public school system. LA Unified is a relatively new system, probably 140, 150 years old. In the grand scheme of human history, that's not a very long time. And public schooling wasn't always an American principle. So this book really chronicles from around 1830 until current times what's been driving our system. And there's been two key principles that these authors argue that drive our school system. What drives LA Unified? Two core values. The first core value is access, that we believe that every citizen, every child should get access to a publicly funded educational experience. Whether their parents are billionaires or whether they're homeless, we believe that it's a right that a child have access to a publicly funded educational experience. Now in 2021, I think if we were being honest and we really were reflective, we could kind of pat ourselves on the back on this because we've achieved it. Now, they don't all have the same experience, but they all get access. And it didn't happen without a fight. We had groundbreaking decisions like Brown versus Board of Education. IDEA, which many of you are, your position is based upon the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, Americans with Disabilities Act. There were times when kids with disabilities couldn't really come to school, or they go to a special school, like a school for the blind or school for the deaf. But there's been an evolution in our system that we've opened our door up to everybody. So good for us. The second core value of the system after access is equity. It is a core value. Why do Cuban and Tyek argue that equity is a core value of the American public school system? Well, we have things like standards. In the state of California, you publish academic performance standards, and they apply to every student in the state of California. Whether you live in Fresno, whether you live in LA, whether you live in Cupertino, they're written descriptions of what a student is supposed to know and be able to do at the end of a year of exposure to an educational institution. And the state of California, like every other state in the country, actually measures student progress through a state assessment or an online assessment. We measure students' progress. So we know that every kid gets access to school. The question we want to answer is, have we met our second core value? And does every student have an equitable experience? And if we were honest, we'd say that answer is a very strong no. That all kids get access to school, but not all students get an equitable benefit. That was one of the premises behind IDEA and RTI, because kids with disabilities were not having the same type of experience in school that others were. They needed access, they needed the least restrictive placement so that they can get exposure and that they could acquire the same type of rigor and develop the same kinds of knowledge and skills that their general education counterparts receive. So we'd be foolish to think that we've reached the threshold of equity. We've done okay with access. We got a long way to go on the second core value. Now, this issue, this promise that hasn't been kept yet, that we haven't achieved equity, we call that the achievement gap. Now, I want to pause for a minute because sometimes people get a little bit testy when it comes to terminology. I like people who say, I don't like the term achievement gap. I agree with you. There are a lot better terms. Some call it the opportunity gap. Some call it the education debt that's been popularized by Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings. There's a lot of different ways to describe it. But what did Shakespeare say? A rose by any other name is still a rose. I'd like to appeal to some of my equity warriors who are on the line. And I'd like to appeal to you as an advocate that naming discrimination in more descriptive terms doesn't mean that we're actually moving the needle on discrimination. I get really frustrated when I go to equity conferences or achievement gap conferences, and all of the presentations are about new ways to describe the same tyranny. If we spent less time trying to come up with new terminology and more time trying to actually solve the problem of equity, I think we can move a lot faster. And I address that in the book. The reason I use the term achievement gap is just for communication, because it's the term that most people are familiar with. And since I want people to read the book and understand it, I don't want to get cute with terminology and then lose the substance. So Harvard describes the achievement gap like this. What is the achievement gap? Or opportunity gap, whatever you want to call it. Call whatever you want to call it. The achievement gap refers to the observed and persistent disparity on a number of educational measures between the performance of groups of students, especially groups defined by their gender, race or ethnicity, language, disability, and socioeconomic status. How do we measure this? We observe these disparities through measures like standardized test scores, grade point average, dropout rates, graduation rates, college enrollment and completion, access to advanced courses, access to gifted and talented, and the list goes on and on. So I have a question for you. If I were to get access to the central office in LA Unified School District, and they were able to pull out a profound variety of data, we're looking at graduation rate, literacy and numeracy test scores, access to advanced opportunities, and we just aggregated that data by gender, by race, by home language, by disability, socioeconomic status. Would we find a persistent disparity? Not just 1 year, not an anomaly, but an observed and persistent disparity. And the answer would be, without seeing your data, is yes. But it's not a Los Angeles problem. It's not a California problem. It's a social issue. The same gaps that exist in Los Angeles exist in New York. They exist in Florida. They exist in Alabama. They exist in Montana. They exist all over this country. And here's hopefully a seminal question I'd like to ask you. If this happens all over the country, a question we have to answer is the problem the student? Is it just something wrong with the kid? Are they just broken beyond repair? Or is there something flawed and discriminatory about how the system serves these students that you see described on your screen? I want to lean on the argument number 2, that a disability doesn't mean an inability. Your gender has nothing to do with your ability to learn. You can learn in more than just English. Your race, your skin color has no bearing on your ability to learn and to achieve. So if we conclude that the problem is the student, then we're barking up the wrong tree. But if we try to take a very deep examination of the system and those who drive the system, we might find through self-examination that we've been unfair to these students from day one, and that a shift in how we serve them will lead to a shift in their benefit. So any of you who are deniers, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I have a lot to cover, go take a look at the data. We live in an environment in 2021 of people who look right at reality and deny it. That the planet's not getting warmer, that coronavirus doesn't exist. It's kind of an odd time intellectually. So if any of you have any real doubts about the real inequities, go check out the U.S. Department of Education Civil Rights Report, where you see that kids of color don't get access to the same opportunities in science and math that others do. That African American Latino students make up almost half of American public school students, but a quarter enrolled in gifted and talented. That suspension rates are higher. Kids of color and kids of poverty attend schools with the highest concentration of less experienced teachers. And we can even add today long-term substitute teachers. Then we wonder why we don't see the same level of achievement. A study I'd like to point you to, I think you find really interesting, was published in the Harvard Education Review, and it was about the benefit of privilege, socioeconomic and racial privilege, in carving pathways for their children to get access to services, particularly gifted services and advanced services that other parents don't know how to manipulate. And then we end up seeing this gross disproportionality when it comes to gifted and talented identification. Well, the system is rigged with favor, privilege, access. So then the data reflects that. So the data is not by accident, not something wrong with the kids. There's a corrupt level of access to those opportunities. If anybody may be thinking, well, Dr. Muhammad, those are big problems. How are we going to fix them? We don't have enough money. I disagree. And the evidence would say contrary. Are you aware that 27 of the 50 American states, their aggregate budgets are higher in the Department of Corrections than the Department of Education? 27 US states spend more money on putting kids in jail than we spend educating. In your transition program, do you think you can use more resources? Do you think that would help your kids transition into society better? But we're spending most of our resources for young people on prison. Unfortunately, California is the biggest culprit, with a $53,000 gap between what we spend on putting a kid in jail and what we spend on educating. What's really sad is that over the last 30 years, youth crime has dropped significantly, but youth incarceration has tripled. We've merchandised young people's lives, and for private prison companies, private corporations who own prisons and benefit and are actually traded on the New York Stock Exchange, when that $53,000 could have been better spent in LA Unified, helping kids with disabilities transition into society and providing more opportunities for populations who've been traditionally locked out of opportunities. We can do better. We're just not asking the right questions. So the whole premise of the book came from a quote from the great Nelson Mandela. And during his second inaugural address as president of South Africa, Mr. Mandela said these words: "The world's problems begin with the belief that some human lives are more valuable than others." That's a very tough pill to swallow. I believe everybody engaged in this webinar today would like to believe that we are humane, that we are open to humanity, that we are empathetic, that we love everybody, that we're compassionate people. But there are parts of us, and I'm including myself, that we don't like to acknowledge. And when we lie to ourselves, it makes it much more difficult. Now, what is Mr. Mandela saying? That all of the social issues that exist in our world start with a group who has more force or authority, declaring that my characteristic is better than yours. And because my characteristic is better than yours, then we accept and justify the marginalization of certain individuals who don't have those characteristics. So what's the root of sexism? A group of men declared that my gender is better than yours. So what does that justify? Restricting women's access and opportunity, restricting pay, being comfortable with a wage gap, Things like date rape are justified through this sick premise. What about racism? My skin color is better than yours. So what does that justify? It justifies mistreatment. It justifies dehumanization. It justifies providing opportunity. I don't need a wheelchair, so therefore my able body is better than you because I don't need the assistance of a wheelchair. So too bad for you. This exists throughout our entire society. And I want to give you an example for anybody that's having a hard time doing a little Michael Jackson and looking at the man and woman in the mirror. I grew up in Flint, Michigan. I know many of you are familiar with Flint, particularly the last 4 or 5 years because of the lead poison in the water. Well, obviously, when this tragedy happened, it affected me as a native son of Flint much more profoundly than most because there's a personal context. I have family in Flint. I have friends I grew up with who still live in Flint. So these were real lives that were familiar to me that were being affected. Here's some information about Flint that you might not be aware of. Flint is 85% African American. And Flint was designated in 2017 by the US Census Bureau as the poorest city in the United States. Flint, Michigan. So what are we looking at? Race and socioeconomic status. When my friends and I first learned about what happened to our beloved hometown, there's a dialogue that was very predictable. We'd say this to each other. If this would have happened in Bloomfield Hills, you might not even know what that is, but that sounds rich, doesn't it? To give you a little better context. If this would have happened in Malibu, if this would have happened in Cupertino or Mountain View or Orange County, the government would have done what? They would have intervened immediately. So what do we know? That when certain things ill affect a group of people that we value, there's a very different efficacious reaction from our society than when it happens to people that we value less. So what's my argument? The reason that we continue to see these perpetual achievement gaps is that the students that are ill affected, they don't stimulate a level of empathy and concern among us like they would if they were kids that we really value. So what do the gaps say? We don't value kids of color collectively. We don't value kids with disabilities. We don't value kids of poverty. And we do it under this cloak of lying to ourselves. And in the book, I refer to this as functional hypocrisy. It's the gap between who we say we are and how we really behave. And it's not something that I'm just want to throw out on our society. We do it as educators. If I were to come to LA Unified and I was to read your LA Unified School District mission statement, I bet it sounds very, very inclusive. What did it probably say? We want every child to be a lifelong learner, to reach his or her fullest potential in a world of rainbows and unicorns and Skittles. But ask a teacher to do to engage in a co-taught class with a mix with kids with IEPs and kids without IEPs and see how serious they are. Ask somebody to make their lessons culturally responsive. Ask someone to help a student with an intervention or engage in an intervention system. And what happens? Who we say we are, it's tested by who we really are. We love to say we care for all people. But if we really looked and examined, our appetite to serve all doesn't match our rhetoric about all. So kids with disabilities become acceptable casualties. Kids of color become acceptable casualties. Because at the root of it, if we want to have a really deep conversation, is that we do not respect and honor and value all human life equally. And until we start to have that dialogue, been talking about we need to have conversations. We're going to move slowly forward. We want to allow more people at the table. That sounds like more like charity than equity. And it comes off as very paternalistic. It comes off as very insulting because all human life is important. The problem is we have been comfortable with the hypocrisy of saying that we care about all, but serving some. I'm going to prove it. So I want to share a tool with you. You have it in your Google Doc. And what I ask you to do, it's a data inventory, an equity inventory, where we organize the template for you to, as a staff, to start to look at how equitably do you serve students in your district or in your particular school. And it disaggregates data around reading, math, science, writing, access to advanced courses, honor roll, AP classes. Then we flip it and look at truancy. We take a look at suspensions, and we disaggregate them by all of the typical variations in student population: race, gender, disability, socioeconomic status, home language. And we ask you to take a look at that inventory once you fill it out, and you'll find where your gaps are. Here's something I like to share with school districts that I work with. If you're really serious about equity, measure it regularly, reflect upon it, and act upon it. There are very few things that I find more irritating as a consultant than working with the district who says they're serious about equity and they have no evidence of their inequity. They don't monitor it, they don't collect it, they don't make decisions based upon it. So if we look at our advanced courses and only 2% of our kids with disabilities get access, that's a problem. So wouldn't a progressive school work intentionally to open up access and methodically set goals and targets to increase the access of their kids with disabilities? Schools and districts that speak of equity in general terms, it bothers me. Like what? Well, Dr. Muhammad, our African-American males are really struggling. We don't know what to do. Well, Dr. Muhammad, our kids who are English learners are really struggling. What does that even mean? Struggling with what? Compared to what? Are you measuring it? Are you monitoring it? Are you changing practice to impact it? If not, it's just dogma to make us feel better. Because if you really looked at the data, you go to the second question on this pause to think, it would make us sick to our stomach. And if it's sick to our stomach, we do something about it. So let's get into the transition into the work I'd like to encourage you to do. I am a big advocate, as Anne read, for professional learning communities. I am a protege of the late Dr. Rick DeFore, and we just published the third edition of the original Professional Learning Communities book early this month called PLC at Work, Revisiting PLC at Work. And the late Dr. DeFore used to always say to me, Anthony, the goal of professional learning communities is not to become a professional learning community. PLC is a means to an end. So what is the end or the goal of a professional learning community? You'll find it in the book, Learning by Doing. Here's what Dr. DeFore wrote. When a school or district like LA Unified functions as a professional learning community, educators within that system embrace high levels of learning for all students. Let's unpack that. All means regular ed, special ed, male, female, tall, short, black, white, Latino, Asian, Pacific Island, Native American. All kids is both the reason that system exists and the fundamental responsibility, all of those who work within. So what's the argument? If your goal is learning for all, and that it's our responsibility, that working together should be obvious. Doing the right work focusing on the development of each student would be obvious if that's what drove our system. But I want to argue that's not what drives traditional systems. In order to do equity work, there has to be a significant shift in paradigm. I want to make a bold statement. Our old or traditional ideology in American public schools cannot accommodate equity. It just can't. Our old paradigm is that education is the student's responsibility, and it's our job to offer learning. That learning is an invitation. We call that meritocracy. What Dr. DeFore was describing is that learning is our purpose and our responsibility, and it should be a guarantee, not an offer. If learning is a guarantee, we would act differently than if learning was an offer or an invitation. Let me describe it to you. I want you to think of the old system of delivering educational services like an all-you-can-eat buffet. Now, because of the pandemic, those may never open again. Those the CDC would call a super spreader activity. But anyway, I digress. Think of our old system like an all-you-can-eat buffet. What do we learn from Cuban and Tayeb? All kids get invited to the educational experience. Now, when I grew up, I was offered that opportunity. And if I did well, my teachers were happy. If I didn't do well, they were kind of told me I didn't care. I didn't study hard enough. I needed to be a little bit more diligent. So there was, they were happy if I ate, but they weren't really bothered if I starved. So if learning is just an invitation, we got a big steaming hot tray of science, we got a salad bar of math, we got a little bit of dessert tray of English. Come on in, kids. Help yourself. Here's some questions I want you to think about. Who's going to benefit? Number one, we have to ask ourselves, what's being served? Whose tastes and diet are being considered when preparing the buffet? And who's given easiest access? The kids who benefit most from our current system, I call the buffet kids. Why? Let's describe it. These are probably kids whose parents come from a high socioeconomic background, particularly parents who've been successful and achieved some degree of success in post-secondary education. So what do the kids learn? What are they socializing? That eating from the buffet and being successful in that endeavor has a direct effect on quality of life and socioeconomic status. What else is being middle class do or rich? Access to good health care, access to good food, access to travel, to a literacy-rich environment. What language is probably spoken in the buffet home? English, because what are all the signs in the buffet written in? English. Would a kid with a disability or without thrive? It'd be a kid without a disability because they're not helping the kid. They had to figure it out themselves. So if you're able-bodied, it's a lot easier. What about race? People get nervous when I describe the buffet kids to race. Probably white. Why? Here's a question I want to ask you. How many of you have ever taken a group picture before? A staff photo, a family photo. When you get the picture back, who's the first person that you look for when you get that picture? When you look at the print yourself. Did I do the duck lips? Did you get the right angle? Was my eyes closed? Everybody on this webinar, it's not vanity. You want to look good in the picture. If I'm white, I've been in the center of the picture since I've been in pre-K. From the novels that have been chosen, to the language that's spoken, to the heroes and sheroes of history, to the narratives around the innovations around math and science. It's been a love story to me. If I'm not white, I walk the buffet trying to find something familiar and pleasing to me, and I can't find it. So what we find is this buffet was tailored for a certain type of kid. And when a student doesn't embrace it, they can't find themselves. They don't have easy access. None of the food really fulfills them. They can't find themselves in the picture. Then they opt out. And then what's our dialogue? How do we motivate the unmotivated? Well, who unmotivated? Who wants to eat out of somebody else's kitchen their entire lives? Never find anything familiar. Be condemned because you don't fit a certain prototype. And then we wonder why kids don't like school from certain populations, because the buffet was not made to serve every kid. It was tailored to suit a particular type of student. What is Dr. DeFore saying? The goal isn't to offer kids the opportunity to be academically nourished. It's to make sure that they're nourished. So what will that require? It may require changing some of the selections, extending cafeteria hours. Some kids might take longer to chew. Some might need to be fed. We're going to judge our success or failure based upon our kids nourished properly when they leave us. Some might need a different method. Others might need more time. Others might need more encouragement. Some we might have to put them on life support till they can get, but nobody leaves LA Unified ill prepared. When that ideological shift happens, a whole new world of practice opens up. So I want to describe for you why our traditional system has failed to meet the needs of diverse students and why it just can't be tweaked. It has to be dissolved and replaced. I described our old system of delivering educational services, the buffet method, as meritocracy. What is a meritocracy? It's defined as a system in which the talented are chosen and moved ahead based upon their perceived achievement. Let's break down this concept. Number one of the things that makes it really overwhelming is that it's a system. Systems are very complex. And by nature, according to Max Weber, systems are not made to change. Systems are made to be perpetuated. So one of the things that really concerns me is I see so many sincere people who are protesting for changes to systemic discrimination. I think sometimes they don't really understand the depth of a system. We see when it changes the system of criminal justice. Is it the laws? Is it policing? Is it the prosecutor? Is it the court system? Is it the private prisons? Systems are complex. So sometimes we stop short of going deep into equity because the system seems so complex and immovable. The second challenge, very important, what is talent? Is talent going to be the basis that people are rewarded in a meritocratic system? Then who defines what talent is? Is analytical skill talent? Is literacy talent? Is numeracy? Is creativity? Is artistic ability? Talent is so broad that it's really difficult to narrow down and define. But here's the worst part. Who's doing the choosing? If you go to your thesaurus and you look up the term choice, one of the synonyms for the word choice is discrimination. Whenever you choose, you exercise discriminatory judgment. It's not always sinister. If Ann and I went to dinner and the waiter brought us 2 menus and there are 15 entrees, and I ordered a salmon, what am I declaring to the waiter? That of these 15 choices, I declare that the salmon is better than the other 14 choices. Ann might choose the roasted chicken. Does that make her wrong? No. It means based upon her taste, her preferences, she finds that much more attractive to her. So whenever a group of people get a chance to choose, that becomes the bedrock of systemic discrimination. Now, I describe this statistically through a normal distribution or a bell curve. How many of you listening ever had a test graded on a curve in college? I did. A normal distribution is a statistical analysis, but it's just one of many statistical analyses. It's a comparative analysis. That score you receive was not a representation of what you learned. It wasn't a raw score. It was a comparison of your score to the average or the norm of the class. So how do you normally distribute? You take a data set and you find the true mean or the true norm of that data set. And then you distribute the other points around the true mean, the true middle, on both sides, creating a positive half and a negative half. Go to the far right. We look at a bell curve, and I want to ask you this, LA Unified. Look at the light blue, the two light blue parts of this bell curve. At some point in a student's experience in LA Unified, does your system look at all the students in your system and seek out 8, 10, 12% of your kids who somebody judged should be moved ahead because they're smarter than the average kid? And do we typically segregate them, put them on a separate track, give them better access, more rigor, higher expectation? If that happens, and it does in almost every district, what do we call it? Gifted, honors, advanced. What profile of that type of kid dominates that part of the bell curve? The buffet kids, white, Asian, middle class, educated parents, access to preschool, access to support. They're not smarter. The system just favors them more. Let's look at the center, the norm, the 65 to 70% of dark blue. It represents the average or general profile of students in LA Unified. And what do we call those kids? Average, regular, general. Now let's get to the bottom, the left, the outliers negative, who are far below, by our judgment, the norm. We segregate them too. And what do we call them? Special ed, at risk, low performing, tier 3. This starts as early as kindergarten, but becomes institutionalized by secondary. So essentially, your kids, as you transition, they were auditioning since kindergarten for their spot in a prefabricated bell curve. So we look at humanity and we judge that some are more valuable than others. And then we give the ones we like better, or we think are smarter, give them special privileges. We kind of shove the ones we believe aren't as capable on a different track. And then we sit back and say we want to close the achievement gap. Our system produces the achievement gap. It guarantees the achievement gap. So how is meritocracy manifest? In things like grading practices. There are very few practices in schools more harmful to a kid's confidence and efficacy than grading practices. Academic tracking, norm reference testing, school accountability rate. Look at the state of California. All the state does is place all the schools in the state on a bell curve. And guess which districts end up at the top of the bell curve? And the ones that end up on the bottom. And we said, look at those districts. Well, the state doesn't measure what those districts do well. They only honor the assets of the school districts that they value. We even try to do it to teachers by misusing Charlotte Danielson and Bob Marzano's research on teacher evaluation. Where does it make sense? Meritocracy is not evil, dear colleagues. It's just not appropriate if your goal is equity. It's the wrong system. It's the wrong ideology. It's about comparison and competition. You can't say you want all to be successful and then produce a system of comparison and competition. It makes sense in sales or business or athletics or American Idol. It makes sense, but not in school. So I want to show you a quick video of Dr. John Hattie explaining why meritocracy or ability grouping is so detrimental and why we need to abandon it.
Well, tracking actually doesn't have a negative effect size. It has a very close to 0 effect size. And in many ways, that means it doesn't matter whether you track or you don't track, because that's what a zero means when you compare tracking to non-tracking. The problem with tracking is two things. Firstly is the expectations it sets for kids. It says to them very clearly that this is where you perform. And certainly in some subjects, and probably mathematics is the best example, quite often what the teachers then do is they only teach material that's relative to that tracking. So even if you develop and become better at doing mathematics, and you may have the ability to go into a higher track, you can't, because you haven't done the right amount of subjects, you haven't done the right content area. But the biggest problem with tracking by a million miles is the equity issue. Is, for instance, if you look in this country here, there is a high probability of African American and Hispanics being in the lower track groups. How can you possibly defend that apartheid in our schools? How can you possibly argue that kids are destined in terms of how they're going to succeed in life, depending on the color of their skin? That's so indefensible. And so when you take that equity issue into account, and then you take on the other hand the effect size is close to zero, then I think it's incumbent upon us to find ways where we can reduce those inequity problems. And stopping ability grouping is one of the issues. Now we have to be careful here. There is a detracking movement. There is a group trying to detrack, and it's not showing much effect either. And that I think is partly because we then don't come back to attend what really matters, and that is for each individual kid, what is the impact we're having on them? And so that's what I want to come back to. It's about that impact. And one of the problems of the tracking and the ability grouping is it does set expectations which may not be appropriate for many of the students. I am not a fan of tracking because it becomes, people think it's actually solving an educational problem. It's not. It's making the teacher's life easier. And there's nothing wrong with making teachers' life easier. But those teachers who are in a detrack situation, who do have high expectations for all their kids, not only can that be more successful, you don't get the equity problems that you do with tracking. So it's not a straightforward answer. It's not a straightforward problem. But I do think there are some serious problems with the tracking that really make it very hard to defend.
Colleagues, let's unpack that. John Hattie found that breaking kids into red birds, blue birds, and buzzards, creating a system of polarization, has a 0.013 impact size. Letting kids take a nap before learning has a 0.04 effect size. So our whole system is based upon a farce that some kids are smarter than others and they should be segregated and given different opportunities. Why is ability grouping so detrimental, which our whole system is based upon? Two reasons. The first reason is access. A student cannot learn something he or she is never given the opportunity to learn. So why have special ed advocates for years been pushing for full inclusion? A kid can't learn something he's never exposed to. So when you take away the opportunity, you guarantee that that student will always be a second-class educational citizen. Number two, he said the worst problem was equity. John Hattie, by profession, is a statistician. He's a psychometrician. Who did he find when he said this country here? He was talking about the United States. What two groups did he find statistically have the highest probability when we're looking at kids and choosing what part of the bell curve they go through? What kids does the data teach us have the greatest opportunity to get chosen for the bottom? He said African American and Hispanic. So when we're given the opportunity to judge kids' ability, racism kicks in, sexism kicks in, xenophobia kicks in, and we tend to operate off of damaging stereotypes that give some kids opportunities and deny others. He said, what's the better way to go about it? In detrack situations where there's high expectations for all kids, where we analyze the impact of our instruction and practice on each individual kid, not only do we not get the equity problems, all kids thrive, even the buffet kids do better. So I want to close with proposing an alternative. I've beaten up the old system, but I think it's unfair to beat up the old system and not propose an alternative. The alternative I'd like to propose is called egalitarianism. It's going to take a very strong willingness to shift our thinking. It's a different way of serving students. I want to go directly to the second definition. A social philosophy advocating the removal of inequalities among people. I want to ask you a couple of questions. Any of you listening have ever taught a gifted or an accelerated class before? Have you ever had a kid in that accelerated or gifted class who you found had some struggles that you wouldn't have anticipated? And you ask yourself, how did this kid end up in a gifted class? How many of you ever taught a remedial class? Ever had a kid in remedial class that you found was very, very bright and had some strong gifts, but maybe had some deficits in other areas? You ask yourself, how did this kid end up in this class? What happened? When people were able to use their discriminatory judgment, somebody felt that the deficits of student A were acceptable and that the gifts of student B were not worth honoring. What if we stopped doing that altogether? What if we made the assumption that all kids are highly capable and we spent our resources, our gifts, our talents, and our professional practice trying to remove the obstacles that kids have? All kids have gifts. All kids have challenges. What gives us the right to determine which gifts are worth honoring and which challenges are so egregious that we can't allow a kid access to opportunity? Our judgment and the isms keep us stuck where we are. So, Carol Ann Tomlinson, who's world-renowned for her research on differentiated instruction, wrote that excellence in education, we do everything that we can to make sure that students become everything that they can. I'm going to ask you to make a very strong shift because we already know how to build equity. I want you to think about shifting your thinking, our organization's focus, from a norm reference to a criterion reference. A norm reference is a comparison. What's a criterion reference? Criterion reference tests and assessments are designed to measure student performance against a fixed set of predetermined criteria, i.e., concise written descriptions of what students are expected to know and be able to do at a specific stage of their education. So instead of comparing kids to each other, what if we took a different approach to their education? And I want to use the example of basketball. Let's say that all 95 of you are students of mine in a seventh grade PE class. I'm going to teach you a new unit on basketball. Would you all agree with me that the skill of dribbling is essential in learning the game of basketball? It's kind of hard to be successful in basketball if you can't dribble. If I were to assess all of you right now on your current capacity on dribbling, you think you all right now would be at the same proficiency level? I haven't even met you. No, the answer is no. Give me some reasons why there may be some variation. Experience, exposure, interest, physical disability. And if I were to compare you, I'd get a distribution of capacity. But what's the purpose of comparison? What if I took a criterion referenced approach? What if I sat down and collaborated with the other middle school PE teachers and we created a target, a learning target, a criterion of what proficiency looks like for a seventh grader when it comes to dribbling a basketball? Then, what if I were to assess all of you on this video right now and assess your current capacity and not compare you to each other, but do what? Analyze your current capacity against the target or the criteria. Then what if I did this? Analyze your current proximity to the target and then provided you with targeted support, whether it's fingertip control or agility or posture, did a little intervention. And for those who were proficient, gave you an extension to take you deeper into it. Do you think under that methodology, I can get all of you to the standard of proficiency by analyzing your current capacity, analyzing your needs, and then moving into action to respond to your needs and giving you enough time and support tailored to your specific needs, what did Dr. Hattie say? When you're in an environment where there are high expectations for all, we analyze our impact on each individual student and make adjustments based upon that evidence to each individual student's needs. Not only do we not get achievement gaps, but all kids thrive. So some of you who might have had a background in basketball might not need as much support as somebody else. But in the next unit, I might teach volleyball. And that same person who's proficient in basketball might have never played volleyball before in his or her life. They would need intervention. So there's no such thing as a high kid or a low kid. They're just kids. And some kids need support, and some kids are ready to go deeper into concepts based upon experience, exposure. Our job under egalitarianism is to analyze and remove the obstacles to excellence, not to compare, not to segregate. And if we do that, we can help every kid get to the finish line. Criterion reference is the pathway to individualizing our approach to each individual student's need. And it frees us from the burden of discrimination. So the whole premise, the basis of the achievement gap isn't that we don't know what to do. We produce it out of our discriminatory thinking. The impact of the isms, our indoctrination, racism, classism, sexism, misunderstanding of disability. And it produces an improper mindset. And what's a mindset? It's the established set of attitudes held by a person or group of people. So I want to close with this. In this book, the basis of the book, because I just kind of gave you the introduction, my colleagues and I went to study schools who had very compelling evidence around equity. One was Westmont, Illinois, Westmont High School, 100% graduation, 100%. Low socioeconomic area, very diverse. Went to study Westmont. What are they doing in Westmont that other people aren't doing? And the thing that was most apparent is that their mindset was different. I want to get to what we call the liberation mindset. We also studied schools who were struggling and not making any progress on equity. We found that they operated from damaging mindsets. We call those the superiority, which is a mindset of privilege. There's nothing wrong with the system. The problem is the kid. Or the victim mindset, deficit thinking. These kids are so disadvantaged that excellence is something that we can't even imagine. So they either operated from a system of a mindset of privilege or from a deficit mindset. The schools that were making a difference operated from what we call the liberation mindset. In the book, we have rubrics, surveys that you can give your staff, and you can start to analyze where your staff is on their path to liberation. 3 components, I'm gonna let you go. What were the schools producing equity doing that other schools weren't doing? It started with equality of access. I applaud the special ed community for inclusion. A kid can't learn when he never gets the opportunity. In these liberation mindset schools, they weren't putting up barriers, they were breaking down barriers. They had a strong focus on their responsibility for support. If we give you the opportunity, we owe you the support to be successful. And then finally, advocacy. In all the liberation mindset schools that we studied, they were open, vocal, and strong advocates for their children. Whether it was verbally, whether it was using their power to lobby the board, they felt that they were the frontline defenders to their students' success. They didn't just talk about equity, they defended it. In the book, we have a series of surveys that you can give your staff on their beliefs around access, their responsibility for support, and their obligation to be advocates. And there are rubrics that you can actually assess where your school is, where your district is, in the process of being equitable or being liberated. The good news in 2021 is that any school that wants to change their mindset, we've actually produced the tools to help you do it. Because I can give you tools around equity all day long. If your mindset is not that of a liberator, then the isms, the tyranny of status quo overwhelms the ideas, the strategies. We end up with what we always have. So I want to thank you for giving me time with you this afternoon. Hope you found it helpful. You have the PowerPoint, you have the Google Docs, and I hope that this very short period of interaction gave you some insight that we can do right by all kids if we're willing to examine our current practices, really confront the inequity of our past practice, and have a vision for a better future. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Muhammad. Really got me thinking about a lot of different things. I really enjoyed the analogies, the all-you-can-eat buffet and the basketball, and a lot of things that will stick with me for sure. So as a reminder, everyone in the chat box, if you want to access the Google Doc for his file organizer, it's got his resources in there, today's PowerPoint presentation, his biography, information about his book, all of that. So grab that in the chat before we close out the webinar. And also the link, if you want to see the Transition Institute flyer, so you can see previous recordings and also see the dates for the upcoming recordings, that's in there. And also the link to the feedback survey is in the chat box as well. If you can take a minute to fill that out, that's helpful. And like I said, we have a question in there this week asking you for some topic feedback, suggestions for a second edition of the Transition Institute. So that would be really helpful if you can fill that out. So again, thank you, Dr. Muhammad, and we'll go ahead and stop recording and